Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Birch Bark Editing in Conversation event with Ray Nayler and Wendy and Wagner. Thank you for being here tonight. We're so excited to have these two authors who share our love of books and the craft that goes into making them. I have a couple of announcements before we get started, and then I'll turn things over to Wendy, who will introduce Ray to you. And the information for these announcements will be showing up in the chat, or you can go to birchbarkediting.com and see more information there. And so it begins, I'm going in chronological order. Our next In Conversation event is in only 2 weeks on November 1st at 7 p.m. It's with Jennifer Barber and A. Malotkoff. And Jennifer will be reading from her most recent poetry collection, The Sliding Boat Our Bodies Made. And A. Malotkoff will be reading from his poetry collection, Future Symptoms. And then we're departing from our usual schedule, our Tuesday evening monthly gathering. Instead, we're going to host something we're calling our post-election crash party on Wednesday, November 9th at 5 p.m. Eastern. It's going to be our usual mix and meet generative writing workshop format, but we're going to party because at least we're post-election at that point. And then please mark your calendars for Tuesday, December 8th, when our Best of the Net nominees from Microlit Almanac will offer a reading as a fundraiser to benefit Ukraine. So look for more information about that coming soon on our website. And now I'm happy to formally introduce to you Wendy N. Wagner, who is the editor-in-chief of Nightmare Magazine and the managing senior editor of Lightspeed. Her short stories, essays, and poems run the gamut from horror to environmental literature. Her longer work includes the novella The Secret Skin, one of the Washington Post's best sci-fi fiction horror books of 2021, the horror novel The Deer Kings, the Locust best-selling sci-fi eco-thriller An Oath of Dogs, and 2 novels for the Pathfinder role-playing game. She lives in Oregon with her very understanding family, 2 large cats, and a Muppet disguised as a dog. You can find her at windywoohoo.com, which you'll see in the chat. Wendy, over to you.
Hi, thanks. I'm so excited to be here. It's just a real delight, and I couldn't be more excited about introducing this gentleman and his magnificent book. I've gotten to know Ray through working at the magazines. I haven't actually kept count of how many stories we've worked on together, but it's a pretty good handful. And every time one comes across my desk, it is a delight. Even when we don't buy Ray's stories, we love them. Sometimes they're just not quite the right fit for us. Wow. So if you don't know Ray, he's just a real up and coming star in the speculative fiction world. He's been published in just about every major magazine that the genres have. And he's just an all around amazing guy, as well as being an amazing writer. He's spent most of his adult life working in countries that most Americans couldn't find on a map and probably can't even pronounce. He's also funny and an amazing poet, and his new novel is about octopuses, which I'm kind of a little bit obsessed with. Like, I even write every day with this great octopus on my desk. And this book is being celebrated by notaries like David Mitchell, Jeff Vandermeer, and Kirkus and Publishers Weekly have been shouting their heads off about it. So with no further ado, I give you Ray Nayler.
Hey everybody. Thank you, Wendy. I'll have more to say when I introduce Wendy a little bit later, but she's just a really warm and wonderful person. And thank you. That's a very flattering introduction. I want to preface before I start reading from the book a little bit, sort of how the book is structured. Every chapter has a quote which comes from from a book that the main characters wrote. So the chapters are pulled. The chapter quotes are pulled from nonfiction works that are fictional, and then the chapters go on sort of with the main story. So this begins with a quote from another book, which is woven into this book. We understand the encoding of genetic sequences and the folding of proteins to construct the cells of the body, and even a good deal about how epigenetic switches control these processes. And yet we still do not understand what happens when we read a sentence. Meaning is not neuronal calculus in the brain or the careful smudges of ink on a page or the areas of light and dark on a screen. Meaning has no mass or charge. It occupies no space, and yet meaning makes a difference in the world. Dr. Han Nguyen, How Oceans Think. Chapter 4. In the makeshift kitchen, Altan Setseg sat eating a hard-boiled egg. The table was cluttered with the elements of a disassembled rifle, oil rags, several terminals, and various electronic components. Altan Setseg was in a dark blue coverall. There were Velcro strips for identification insignia and patches on the arms of the coveralls and above the breast pockets, but no patches. Her hair was cut close to her head. It was black, with streaks running through it here and there of gray. She could have been 35, 40, or over that. Thick hands, swollen by weather and work, a scattering of dark spots along the hairline on the left side of her face. They might have been mistaken for moles, but Ha had known war veterans before, and she knew that the spots were shrapnel scars. The smell of fresh coffee managed to push back the scent in the lobby of gun oil, ozone, mold, and neglect. An overcast early light came through the windows along with the salt fresh smell of the sea. Altan Setseg indicated a bowl of eggs and a stack of toast near the coffee machine with a flick of her chin. Thanks. Ha poured coffee into one of a half-dozen semi-clean mugs. The heating element under the pot was no good. The coffee was lukewarm. She drank it off in a gulp. She didn't sit down, but grabbed an egg. Ha saw the translator unit on the table amid the still life of gear, eggshell, and crumbs. Team lead? Ha asked. Altan Setseg squinted at her and then nodded, jerking a thumb in the direction of the terrace and beach. Good morning. Altan Setseg shrugged, said a phrase that sounded to Ha like sign igloo, and began rolling another egg on the table, breaking up the shell. Ha reached into a small paper bag she was carrying and produced a macaroon. She placed it in front of Altan Setseg. Altan Setseg regarded it, gave Ha a questioning look. Ha made exaggerated eating motions with her face. Macaroon, she pointed at herself. I made them. A gift. Altan Setseg stared at her with no change in her expression. Just kidding. I would never bake. I bought them in the Ho Chi Minh ATZ, but they are good. She left Altan Setseg sitting there regarding the golden brown bolus of coconut with suspicion. Ha crossed the cracked tiles of the hotel terrace, eating her egg. She could see the team lead, a tall, slender figure standing on the beach facing away from her. Whatever was inhabiting the swimming pool shifted and plopped into the water as Ha passed. The sea was calm, its surface undulated, reflecting the pearl gray and lemon haze of early light, like a curtain agitated by a breeze. As Ha approached, the team lead turned, and Ha stopped, almost tripping in the sand, practically dropping the paper bag she was carrying. The team lead's long hands held several shells of varying sizes. The lead waited while Ha tried to compose herself. Ha had watched an interview on a hotel room ceiling, one of those science popularizing talking heads who did everything from kids shows to documentaries, talking to this person, no, this being, talking to Evrim. The team lead that was standing before her was Evrim, someone she had never expected in her life to encounter. You watched them on a bathroom mirror screen, on a ceiling, or the smeared window of a metro train. You watched people on screen, beings that were shaped like people and spoke like people, but who lived elsewhere. They belonged to a floating world you would never enter, a world where things happened, a place unlike the mundane world you watched from, and you never thought you would meet them, could meet them. But here Evrim was. Evrim extended a hand. I'm so pleased to meet you. I've been anticipating your arrival. Ha shook the hand weakly. You can grip my hand more firmly, Evrim said. Its development cost over $250 million. Much of the technology used in its construction is military, from prosthetic limbs. I don't think it will break. Evrim smiled at Ha. And Ha felt herself searching for something in the eyes, something in the way Evram stood, a difference, but she could not see it right away. The hand was cool, dawned by the seaside cool, but with a warmth behind it, perfectly analogous to the internal warmth of a human hand. There were grains of sand on the fingers and palm from the shells Evram had been collecting. Ha realized that she had been holding on to the hand for too long and released it. Ha! Yes, Dr. Han Wen, I welcome you, and I see you know who I am. Evram turned to look at the sea again, and Ha realized she was giving her a moment to recover from her shock. She was being rude. Evram was taller than her by 30 centimeters. His face was long, his limbs long, his proportions were even, beautifully neutral, a bit idealized. He had the kind of build that wore even fantastically ugly clothes well, and so was used in mannequins for display and on catwalks. And Ha realized that she was referring to Evram in her mind as he, as him, but Evram was not that. He was, they were, what? I see you know who I am. Did she? What did she know? Ha's mind ran down the list of what Evram was. Evram was the only allegedly conscious being humankind had ever created. An android, finally realized, the most expensive single project accepting space exploration ever undertaken by a private firm. The moment it was said repeatedly that humanity had been waiting for, conscious life from nothing but the force of our own technological will. Pause there.
Gosh, that was just so exciting to hear. I loved it. Ah, so great to hear the words in your voice.
So I never I'd never have read out loud my own work in public. This is actually the very first time, and the events that I've done until now have always been like sort of question and answer events about the book. So that's the first time I've ever like had to perform or read my own work.
Oh,
So so it's a big first. I hope
wow.
it's all right.
I'm honored to have been there for your first reading of this great book. It's so cool. So this is the part where I get to ask you questions, right?
I think so. Is that correct? I believe it is.
I'm trying to remember the menu. Oh, good. First of all, I just want to say that for me, one of the strengths of this book were obviously two great, powerful strengths. And that is that you have a story built on incredible concepts. This is a very smart book. When you get done reading it, you will feel smarter because you will have gotten to think about things that are, wonderfully intellectual. But also, it's a very warm and human book, packed with these wonderfully drawn characters. And I think in just the passage that you read for us, you showed us like just some great moments for each of the three main characters that we see in the novel. There are a couple more figures that show up, but these are three who kind of a lot of the action happens around. And one of the things that I think you do super well in the story is every character. We talk about in writing and in the craft of trying to come up with the telling detail, right? Like that's a word that writing instructors use a lot, being like you want to pick the details that perfectly express the situation and things like that. But you do that so well with the characters. Here, just that wonderful moment with Ha saying, oh, I baked these macaroons. No, I would never do that. I bought them. It's like such a magnificent detail. And Evram out picking up seashells, like having this deep interest in looking at the world and exploring it. And so I think one of our goals for tonight is to talk a lot about craft and to help share with other people how we go about our craft and delve into it. And so I was wondering, like, if you could kind of share like the process that you went into finding these telling details for these characters. Like, I don't feel like that. I mean, maybe it happens organically for you. Maybe you're one of those people, you're just like, it's magic. But I feel like you have like a mind that like thinks hard about how these things happen. So if that's the case, I'd love to hear about how that works for you.
So I think when I think about my characters, when I think about characters in a book, so first of all, I kind of back up. Like I sort of struggled with what part of the book to read, because the book is kind of like, it's very difficult to select a part to read, because there's so much leading up to every part that I feel like there's just a lot that will be unexplained. And I realize that, like, even reading, this is from chapter 4, is kind of dropping people in the middle of something that they're not going to completely understand. But the reason I chose this was actually to because of something that occurred to me just a few weeks ago, which is that I remembered writing this book, and I remembered getting stuck early on in the book. I knew I wanted to write about octopus intelligence. I knew a lot of the things that I wanted to do in the book, and I had set myself this like challenge, and I understood what was kind of ahead of me, and then I felt like there was something lacking. And when I was writing this scene, I didn't know who the team lead was going to be. And Evrim actually, like, so Evrim is an android, and one of my personal beliefs is that robots wouldn't have gender. So this quite often we have these like androids that are men or women, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. So Evrim is gender neutral. What unfolds in this conversation is that Ha has been thinking of Evrim as he or him, but in fact, that's not an accurate description of who this being is. Anyway, Evrim literally arose from the beach, like in my mind, and became almost sort of whole, exactly who they are in the book, and actually allowed me to write the book, because so much of the book, I think, relies on the interaction between Evrim and this artificial intelligence that is unsure whether it is conscious or not, and that the world is unsure of, and the octopus, and the unsureness around the octopus communication. So without Evrim, I think the book couldn't have been completed. But Evrim really is one of those magic moments. And I think what happened was that I was reading Shakespeare. I was rereading Shakespeare. I grew up reading Shakespeare, and my mother did, one of her greatest gifts that she gave me was a love of Shakespeare. We used to, when I was a little kid, read these summaries of the plays, talk about the plays, and then go watch them, and then talk about them afterward. It was kind of this project of hers. And I was rereading Shakespeare, and I was also just reading things about islands, because I knew I was setting the book on an island. So I reread the Tempest, and Evrim was sort of what happened when the Tempest and like all of my thoughts about consciousness and AI and stuff combined. So Evrim sort of just appeared and allowed me to continue to write this book. And that's sort of why I chose this moment, because it really was one of those, it doesn't happen all the time. I plan a lot, but it was one of those moments where I'm up early in the morning. It's 5 a.m. usually when I'm writing. I'm kind of in this fugue state, and that allows some magic to happen. And Evrim is like magic. Like Evrim just came out of nowhere and made it possible for everything else to happen.
That is awesome to hear. I have to agree with you. Like, I feel like Evrim is like critical to this story, because obviously this is a book that's about kinds of minds, right? And so when I was in college, I was a philosophy major, and my favorite class was philosophy of mind. And so, like, I knew that was going to be part of this book. And at one point, you turn a page and there's a line from a character, and they say, "What is it like to be a bat?" Which, if you took philosophy of mind, that just like, boop, it's like one of the most famous thought experiments of like all time is Nagel's bat, right? And so for me, that was a moment, just like a wonderful gift. But you're talking about a book that's dealing with a lot of very complex concepts like semiotics and philosophy of mind and the nature of communication and the philosophy of language, and of course there's lots and lots of stuff about biology too. I think for so many writers we kind of fall into this place where when we have a project, we have to do research. And most of us, I think, most writers are nerds, right? We like love getting into the books and stuff. But then there's this moment when you have to bring it all together and you have to make it something for other people. And do you want to dive into a little bit of like how you sort of like broke down these like ideas and how you made them kind of, for people who aren't PhDs in philosophy or science or biology?
I love this E.M. Forrester line where he says, "How do I know what I think until I see what I say?" There's this way in which, writing or vocalizing our thoughts allows us, I think, to think better. And so part of the process of writing this book was actually trying to translate really complex nonfiction topics that I was reading that were academic level writing, written for a very specific audience, into something that would be not only engaging and understandable, but very enjoyable for people to read, because I really want people to enjoy reading the book. And so the one of the things that I was really trying to do is, I don't believe that I understand something unless I can explain it to someone who hasn't encountered it before. That's how I determine whether I have been able to fully absorb an idea. And so part of the book's chapters, as I said before, they start out with these little snippets of Han Wen's book, How Oceans Think, and then also of Dr. Minerva Daughter Chan's book, Building Minds. And what those sections are in particular are these my translations of complex concepts. So they were quotes from really academic texts, like long passages that I engaged with and like retranslated and worked through like my sort of personal system, and then rewrote and kind of expanded on and placed in the book. So a lot of the book is about taking that kind of heavy research and then reprocessing it. But I think that another way that you do that as a writer, I'm at least, well, I should say, I should always use I. Another way that I do that as a writer is to always have my eyes looking out of my characters' positions in the world, and understanding things only through them, and not taking the shortcut of having an understanding that is outside of their understanding. So this book is all written in this third person, we call indirect discourse, right? There's several different names for it, but basically where a character's thoughts and the narrator's narration are indistinguishable from one another. And whatever position is being taken up by the book, and it's not only via Ha, but also via a couple of other characters, there's no information outside of that position. And so I think that's sort of one of the ways that you translate that as a writer, is to be honest about what your characters could know. And I mean, these are, Han Wen is a specialist in cephalopod communication, a marine biologist, highly trained. I mean, some reviews of the book have, talked about how the characters sort of discourse with one another about really complex topics, and how they, some people don't feel like that's realistic. I mean, I would counter that. I discourse with people about really complex topics all the time. My wife and I have conversations much like the conversations the characters in the book have about things, because we translate books that we're reading for one another. So I think that's kind of, I don't know if that answers the question, but that's kind of how I do this. I want to respect my readers' joy in reading, and the way in which they are choosing to spend their time. You know, someone describes Sesame Street and this sort of children's education as, you know, you want children to learn with as little effort or discomfort as possible. I feel like that should always be true, and it almost never is of the books that I subject myself to, and I don't want to subject other people to that kind of pain.
That's so good to know. I think we have time for at least another question. So this is more of like a logistics kind of question, because this book it's got a large number of point of view characters. It's got a lot of different threads going on. It has a lot of huge themes going on, right? Like there's like this themes about about other minds. There's the themes about like how minds work. There's themes about being in the world, and there's themes like my favorite is about like caring and relationships as well. And so you've got this over many characters, and all of these things need to come together. How did you keep track of it all as you are writing? Like, if you were going to give tips to our people out in the audience who are maybe thinking, maybe I should write a book like this with lots of threads and ideas, like what guidance would you give them?
I wish I had good advice for that. I don't have a system for doing that. So some people are put it down on the page, just get it out, first draft writers. Like, it doesn't matter if it's good to them, whatever, just dump it out and then fix it later. I start every single morning, usually by backing up 5 to 10 pages and re-editing what I wrote the day before in order to sort of re-find that like voice, and then moving forward. And sometimes I'll only write a chapter's like last couple paragraphs, or maybe I'll do just a few lines, because I'll spend most of my time re-editing or adding something in or layering something back into the book. I think I don't really need to worry too much about keeping track most of the time, because I'm doing so much. I've already seen these scenes so many times that they're really ingrained in my head. But one thing that I do is that I will use the comments function in Microsoft Word, and I will like add a comment to a paragraph and say, this theme needs to be picked up later, but in reverse from this person's perspective. Or more has to be said about this unfinished thought that this character had later. Or this passage needs to be mirrored in a later section of the book, to kind of guide my hand with things that are going to occur much further on in the manuscript, just so I won't forget. So I do a little bit of that. And then I think you'll notice that if you read The Mountain and the Sea, we'll notice that it's very recursive. Like there are sections that come back and are repeated, and there's a lot of people recalling things that happened before in the book, or recalling them differently, or re-inscribing meaning onto earlier events that wasn't there. And I think that's another way that I'm constantly going back into the book and re-inscribing for myself kind of where it's going. And so I'm always keeping track. That wouldn't work, I think, if you were like one of these sort of just dump it on the page first draft writers, but I'm just like a slow, careful chiseler. Like just a very different. By the time I was done with the first draft of this book, it was 95% identical to the final version. Probably.
We have a very similar writing process, I think. Yeah. Only sometimes I do make charts because I'm like, freakishly organized after working at the magazine for so long. Ray, do you want to keep talking on questions like this, or would you like if I read a little bit from The Secret Skin and we talked about that for a little while?
Yeah,
Would that be good?
Let's go over it. Let's go over from that. I'm excited about this.
Okay.
So I would like to talk a little bit about Wendy. You've heard her bio, but so Wendy is just one of my favorite editors. to work with. And I will often so this is sort of like I'll open up the back door a little bit and let you see like behind the process. I will sometimes submit things to Wendy first, not because I think that her two magazines that she's editing are the first or perfect venue for the story, but because I would love to work with her. So she has won me over in a way that, like, I will send stories sometimes first to Lightspeed, even though I know that they could be published in a slightly larger venue, or I think that they could, because I want to work with Wendy. And so, you know, she just brings this incredible kind of acumen to the process. A lot of editors don't do much in the way of like improving a story. I feel like they just kind of scan it for mistakes or something like that. But Wendy has always like pointed at least one or two things out in my stories that have just made them much better. And so that is why I adore her, and I think that she's just she's doing exactly what an editor should be. So I think that that craft really shows in her writing process as well, and I think you'll see it when she reads from The Secret Skin. She really has a sense for the language and for its finer edges that I think very few people have right now. So over to you, Wendy.
Gosh, Ray, you almost made me cry. Okay, so I'll read a little bit from The Secret Skin, which came out last fall. It's very different flavor from Ray's science fiction, because we're talking about like a gothic novel right here, right? So you've got, I'm just going to read from the very beginning. Last night, I dreamed of Stormbreak, dear Lillian, for the first time since we escaped that salt place. Neither you nor Abigail stood beside me. I was alone, an invisible witness, a pair of eyes suspended in the mist. Down the front driveway I came, sweeping over the moon-white length of crushed oyster shells, and in my dream the house was not the place I said goodbye to that night with the roses clawing at our legs, but instead the house of my childhood, all lit up for one of Mamma's parties. Servants moved past me in the sweet spring night, their coattails swinging as they hurried to meet the guests in their motor cars. The dream figures were sometimes Frederick, and sometimes Beeman, and sometimes they were somehow both. The sounds, though, were perfect. You don't realize how much the sounds make a time or a place. Stormbreak in its heyday had its own pattern of sounds. Always, somewhere, there was an engine, the snarl of someone's Mercedes, or the smooth growl of one of my father's boats. Day or night, there was always some reason to run a motor, much to Daddy's joy. On the far side of the grounds, the horses made their own funny music, a counterpoint to the constant tinkling laughter of the guests. And always the sea. You remember that, Lil. Sometimes I wake in the night missing the sound of it, and only you can sing me back to sleep. If there was one reason to go back to Stormbreak, it would be to stand on the great cliff and watch and listen to the endless murmuring motion of the waves. But I cannot. That house, as we knew it, is gone. I was born in Stormbreak, and I very nearly died in it. On the worst nights, and nights when the trains make an endless screeching, or Abigail wakes in one of her fits, or I've been drinking too much bootleg whiskey. On those nights, I think perhaps I should have died there. But some nights, most nights, Lillian, I lie in your arms, and I try not to think about Stormbreak except to be glad that I have seen the last of it. It was built, and it lived, and it died, that house. It awakened to the kind of life that only living things can know, for it was a great house, the first of its kind in its wild place. And like all great houses, it breathed in secrets and whispered them in the dark. The ones I know, I'm writing this letter to explain to you. The ones I don't, well, I suppose that they, like Stormbreak, remain the province of the wind and the waves and the things that watch beneath the ragged petals of the roses. I'll just get a tiny bit from chapter 1, which starts right after this. A passenger train ran from Portland to Coos Bay, but given my family, it was cheaper to catch one of our street steamers headed south. The ships didn't usually put in on the route from Gray's Harbor to San Francisco, but for my brother, they made an exception. That's how it was when you were a Vogel. There were bigger shipbuilders and richer lumber companies, but my family did well enough. That was only a year ago, but it feels much longer sitting here writing this letter in our little set of rooms. Mrs. Hendricks, the headmistress at the Ladies' Academy, had ridden with me to the riverboat that would take me from Portland to the coast. We didn't talk much, but that suited me. We'd never been close, my employer and I, but we both knew I had no desire to return to my family's estate. At the dock, she gave me a new pair of gloves. Joseph, our driver and handyman, gave me a stiff, whiskery hug that nearly knocked off my cloche hat. I couldn't remember the last time someone had hugged me. Not even my pupils were much inclined. If anyone in my family had ever hugged me, I suppose it was Frederick. Of all my siblings, he spent the most time at my family's Oregon habitation. We were the closest in age, although he had a good 10 years on me, and we both had my mother's skin. It made him shy as a boy, all his scales showing beneath his short pants. But once they were hidden away, he became as friendly and delightful as a golden retriever. People said he took after my mother that way. She was known from Seattle to Sacramento for her gracious ways and wonderful parties. Being gracious is not the same as being friendly or kind or loving, but it counts a very great deal inside the Portland, San Francisco, Southern Oregon social circles that my mother ran in. And we'll stop there so we have a little more time to chat.
I love that line about being gracious not being the same as being kind. I actually highlighted it on my ebook, and I just thought it was it was a new thought. You know, it was one of those lovely moments in fiction where you find this little gem embedded in there, this kind of idea that helps you more finely tune your ideas about the world, right? That being gracious is not the same as being kind, right? That there are these sort of fine edges to how that's different, and it really made me stop and think about like, you know, what that how that what that means about her mother, right? Like describing her that way. I thought the form of this novel. So first of all, I love Gothic fiction, and this is like very firmly rooted in that Gothic tradition with the great house and all of these lovely tropes, which you sort of see coming, right? And you expect them, and you're really glad when they arrive, and you want to see how they're going to be turned and used. And the book is very playful in that way. Like it has this sense of like your knowledge, really deep knowledge of the Gothic genre, and then how you're going to use it, and like what tropes you're going to accent and what things you're going to turn differently. But I thought one thing that was really unique about the book was the structure, which is it's not exactly an epistolary novel. There's this really interesting moment where, so she goes from addressing her lover as you to inserting her lover as a, you know, in the third person, right, in the book as just another character, and describing her in these really neutral sort of terms. And I thought that was a really interesting choice. Can you talk a little bit about like how you decided on how you were going to structure this?
So I tried writing this book a couple of different ways, and originally had been in just sort of like a first person, but I wanted to give it, I don't know, like something more. And I was really focused. So the main character is an artist, right? And she does all this sketching and at the very beginning, she refers to herself as just a pair of eyes in the mist. And kind of part of the character's journey in the story is to go from feeling like someone who just watches the world to being a person who can impact the world. And I think her, as she's telling this tale, I think as she's diving into the memory, she finds herself trying to just be that, this is a witness, I am a witness, this is my recounting of the story. And so to do that, a lot of time, that's why she does put like Lillian just becomes a character in the story, because it just seems like the right thing for her. Like she's like, I'm just trying to be, objective like a witness. So I think that's kind of how that came to be, was really trying to dig into what does it mean to be a witness, and what does it mean to, be an active person in the world.
Yeah, I know that recently there's been a lot of criticism over critics actually saying that a character is not active enough, that they're too passive, etc. But I love how one of the themes of this book, and it's a theme of the mountain and the sea, interestingly enough too. That's kind of where I saw the books come together. Is the theme of involvement, right? That like one has to stop just watching things and become involved in one's own existence and involved in what's going on in order to truly have connection to others and empathy and those kinds of, and like the fullness of human relationships, which are painful, right? And I saw a lot of this book as being the arc for the character as an arc from the eyes in the mist and this kind of passivity to full involvement in the action of the book as it moved forward. And I thought that was really interesting. It was why did you choose that theme for this book? Like, how does it resonate with you, that theme of like watching versus being involved, and how that kind of plays out in your own experience?
Well, I think there's a lot of personal things to it. Is like I feel like as a child, I definitely grew up in an environment where I didn't feel like I could do anything right, right? I had sisters that told me I was clumsy and awkward, and oh, let me do it for you, you'll just mess it up, that kind of thing. So I had a real strong sense of like learned helplessness, right? So that meant that I grew up just looking at things and being afraid to handle them. And then coming into adulthood, I just had to do things for myself, and wanting to become more and more active and engaged in my own life. And just so I felt like, while June, the main character, is an adult in this book, she's still just very undercooked, she's very underdeveloped. And so I felt like I sort of brought some of my coming of age issues to her. Poor girl. But I also think like that's sort of a situation that more and more humans are sort of living with. I think we live in a landscape where, particularly for kids so much now, they don't have the chance to do hands-on things. So many kids are just staying home and living on the world through their phones. I feel like so many adults are that way too. As I think like this is sort of an issue of our times.
Yeah, I see that as well. And I feel like that feeling of, I have a shirt that like a favorite t-shirt, which is of the Titanic sinking, and then of this hand coming out of the water and filming the Titanic sinking
Oh,
on a cell phone.
oh, that's good.
and, and I feel like in some ways, like that metaphor replaces for me the famous metaphor of like polishing the brass on the Titanic, is like filming the Titanic sinking while you drown, right? And in some ways, I almost feel like that's like kind of what we are doing. But I also And I want to leave a little bit of time for other people to ask questions. So I hesitate to even ask one more question, but I was really interested in the skin and what that sort of metaphor of skin really meant for you in this book, because I kept expecting it to be something like else, right? And I never quite understood where you were going to go with it. So I'd just be curious to hear how it resonated for you and why you use that as the central sort of metaphor.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's a book that's all about a watcher, and it's a book about a family that's extremely concerned with appearances, right? Like they've grown up with these parents that want to look perfect in society. And the mother even went so far as to sort of like push her son to marry a close relative, which their family has a skin condition that runs within it. And because they have, married someone who shares that skin condition, then they have a child who dies because it's actually a real skin disorder called ichthyosis, but I have played around with it to make it more fictionally appealing. But it is a disorder that infants can die from. And so I just kind of felt like for me, the skin did what I wanted it to do, to talk about like how poisonous it can be to be focused so much on appearance and not on being your authentic self, which is kind of, the goal of the main characters, for her to grow and become her own real person. So I don't know. Nobody ever talks about the skin part of this book. It does give you a lot of great excuses to bust out like all the gross soaps that people used to use and the terrible brushes that you would scrub yourself with. And
Yeah,
there's lots and lots of lotion involved as well.
yeah, it's very effective body horror. I have to say.
That's so great. You all have been so interesting. And when you were just talking now, it got me thinking about how, Wendy, you were bringing in things from your own experience in childhood. And Ray, you've talked about how your time in Vietnam has influenced your book. But what about your literary influences? And you can just answer whoever wants to go first, but who do you think really helped bring you, or influence your literary chops? Wendy first, apparently.
Well, it's really easy to answer about The Secret Skin because I specifically dove into it, like wanting to do an homage to two of my favorite writers, Shirley Jackson and Rebecca Du Maurier. So, the very first line on this book is obviously sort of cribbed from Rebecca. And then, like, the structure, the opening, which echoes sort of at the ending, but it's sort of a different flavor. It's obviously a response a little bit to The Haunting of Hill House. So I think like it's very easy for me to say yes, those two writers are, sort of parents to me. But obviously, I owe a whole debt of gratitude to Stephen King, and also to, I've got to say, John Joseph Adams, who's the man who publishes Nightmare and is the editor in chief at Lightspeed. I've gotten to work with him for so long that I think a lot of his interests and stuff has rubbed off on me because I've read so many of it in anthologies. So those are sort of like my ancestors. What about you, Ray? Besides Shakespeare, and you're muted, sorry. You're still muted.
So Shakespeare really was a huge one, of course, but so I've sort of had these like two careers. I kind of had a career when I was in my late teens and early 20s as a writer of noir and crime fiction, um, and published a couple stories in Ellery Queen and published a novella with a UK press. And then I sort of got tired of that genre, of writing that genre. I just felt like I wasn't able to come up with new ideas in it, and I moved on to a lot of other things, and then ended up sort of in speculative fiction, largely by accident. I think though that when I go back to like who I admire as a writer, I always return to the great sort of noir novelists of the mid 20th century. Patricia Highsmith, Dorothy B. Hughes, Raymond Chandler, Ross MacDonald, people like that. They were, and the reason I think is because what I love about them is people think of noir as being this sort of blank affect sort of fiction, and it's really not that. What it is like this incredibly compacted emotional charge that hides just below the surface of every sentence. So the stories in noir are incredibly emotional, but the emotion is sort of like this gas under a pressure in every sentence, always contained. And I think that's what's so fascinating for people about the hard-boiled sort of detective stories. Like, if you really read the detective novels, you see that the hard-boiled detectives are incredibly emotional, right? But that their emotion is like firmly contained inside this sort of boiling, almost at the boiling point for the entire book. Um, I, and I think that kind of repression, that sort of limitation of the sentence, just brings this tension that I love. And so when I go to start writing, I start doing two things. I start researching and reading a lot of nonfiction in order to get my subject correct, and I start rereading or reading noir in order to get my mind back into the flow of those like really tight, constricted spaces, because that's sort of what I aspire to, is to pack that much an emotional charge into my own work.
Such great answers. And what are each of you, briefly, what are each of you reading right now? Beyond Shakespeare, obviously, Ray, but that was back when you were working on your novel, right?
Go ahead, Wendy. You first.
Oh, well, I'm always kind of reading a couple of books at the same time. And so it's probably a no-brainer that it being October and a spooky season. I'm reading the brand new Stephen King novel, Fairy Tale, which is outrageously delightful. But I'm also reading a really wonderful piece of nonfiction, which I think just celebrated its 1 year anniversary today. It's called The Korean Vegan by Joanne Lee Molinaro, which is both a cookbook, but also sort of like family history and a lot of thoughts about growing up Korean in the United States. And it is terrific, and every dish looks yummy.
So I just finished a book called Incomplete Nature by Terrence Deacon, and this was a book about consciousness and the mind. It was a huge mountain to climb. It actually took me a couple of months to get through it because it was really, really dense. And on the side, the other book I just finished today was I reread. I had read it first, maybe I think in my 20s, Ross MacDonald's The Moving Target, the first Lou Archer detective novel. Because again, now I'm working on a new book. So I have sold another project that I started after The Mountain and the Sea, and I think that one will be announced in the next couple of months at some point. But I'm now working on another novel, so I'm back to reading noir, as I said before, to kind of tighten up my sentences and make sure that I'm thinking in that tone that I want.
Those sound like such great suggestions. And thank you so much for coming with us tonight and talking about your craft and your process. I'm so excited about both of your books, and it was such a pleasure to have you with us tonight.
Thank you, Max, Kat. This has been wonderful. Everybody in the audience, I just thank you for spending time with us. It's great. And Wendy, I got to see your face for the first time on the screen.
I know, it's so exciting that we got to hear each other's voices. I could listen to you talk all night.
Thank you again. Good night, everybody.
Good
Night, everyone.
night. Thank you.